In the early years of the 1500s, in the Norman city of Rouen, a great tower of pale stone rose slowly into the sky beside the cathedral. It was tall, ornate, and staggeringly expensive, covered in delicate carving, a monument meant to glorify God and impress every soul who passed beneath it, and it was paid for almost entirely by a sin. The sin was butter. That is not a metaphor. The people of Rouen loved butter, and their church had forbidden it during the long weeks of fasting. So the church offered them a deal. Pay a fee, and you may keep eating your butter while you fast. Thousands of people paid. The money piled up. And out of that pile of coins, collected in exchange for permission to eat a soft yellow fat, the cathedral raised a tower so famous that people still call it by its real name, the Butter Tower. Today, butter costs a few dollars a block. It sits in your refrigerator door, half forgotten, something you spread on toast without a second thought. But there was a time when butter was wealth, when it was medicine, when it was holy, when it was banned, and when the guilt attached to eating it was valuable enough to build cathedrals out of stone. So how did something as ordinary as churned cream end up shaping the religion, the class divisions, and the skyline of an entire continent? To understand that, you have to go back to the beginning, not to a dairy aisle, to an accident. Butter is one of the oldest processed foods humans have ever made, and we almost certainly discovered it by mistake. The most likely story goes something like this. Thousands of years ago, nomadic herders needed to carry milk with them as they moved, and they stored it in containers made from animal skins and stomachs, slung across the backs of animals or their own shoulders. As they walked, the milk sloshed and jolted for hours, and that constant agitation did something remarkable. It caused the fat in the milk to clump together and separate from the liquid. When the herders opened their pouches at the end of the day, they found the thin milk had transformed. Floating in it were soft golden clumps of fat. They had accidentally churned butter. That is the entire secret of butter. And like most great secrets, it is almost absurdly simple. Butter is just the fat of milk, agitated until it clumps together and separates from the watery liquid we call buttermilk. Every method humans have ever used, from a skin pouch on a nomad's back, to a wooden churn in a farmhouse, to a stainless steel machine in a modern factory, is doing the exact same thing, shaking cream until the fat gives up and comes together. Some of the earliest evidence we have of deliberate butter making comes from the ancient Near East. There is a limestone panel from the Sumerian civilization, dated to somewhere around 2500 BC, that appears to show figures making butter, rocking a large vessel back and forth to churn it. Think about that for a moment. 5,000 years ago, in one of the first cities humanity ever built, people were already making the same substance you keep in your kitchen right now. But it was in one particular part of the ancient world that butter became something closer to sacred. In India, herders learned to take butter one step further. They heated it gently, cooked off the water and milk solids, and were left with a pure, golden, long-lasting fat we now call ghee. Ghee did not spoil the way fresh butter did, which made it enormously valuable in a hot climate. And it became far more than food. In Hindu tradition, ghee was and still is a holy substance. It is poured into sacred fires as an offering to the gods. It is burned in lamps, in temples. It is used in rituals marking birth, marriage, and death. Ancient Indian medical texts prized it as a healing substance, believed to sharpen the mind, strengthen the body, and extend life itself. For thousands of years, in one of the world's great civilizations, clarified butter has been a bridge between humans and the divine, and a medicine as much as a food. Even the word we use carries an ancient fingerprint. Our word butter comes from the Latin butyrum, which the Romans borrowed from the Greek word boutyron. And that Greek word appears to break down into two older pieces, bous, meaning cow or ox, and tyros, meaning cheese, cow cheese. The very name suggests that to the Greeks who coined it, butter was a slightly foreign curiosity, a strange cheese-like thing made by other people. Because here is the surprising truth about the ancient Mediterranean. The Greeks and the Romans, the great civilizations at the heart of the classical world, did not really eat butter at all. They were people of the olive. Olive oil was the fat of the Mediterranean, used for cooking, for lamps, for cleaning the body, for medicine, for for religious rites. It was everywhere, and it was theirs. Butter, by contrast, was what other people ate. Colder people, northern people. The tribes beyond the civilized world, in the forests and plains of northern Europe, where olive trees could not grow. To a Roman, cooking with butter was a marker of the barbarian. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century AD, described butter as a food of the barbarian nations, though he noted it was considered a great delicacy among them, one that distinguished the rich from the common people. The Romans did use butter, but mostly as a medicine and an ointment, something you rubbed on skin or wounds, not something you spread on bread. To the sophisticated Mediterranean palate, eating butter was a little bit like eating the food of a lesser world. And this is where butter did something that would echo for the next 2,000 years. It drew a line across Europe, a fault line between two entire ways of eating, and in some ways two entire cultures. In the warm south, around the Mediterranean, the fat of choice was olive oil, and it carried the prestige of Greece and Rome. In the cold north, where olives would not grow, the fat of life was butter. That divide, the oil south and the butter north, did not fade when Rome fell. It hardened, and centuries later, it would collide with the most powerful institution in Europe, with consequences almost no one could have predicted. Because in the cold north, butter was not a luxury or a curiosity, it was survival. As the centuries passed and the population of northern Europe grew, butter became one of the essential engines of the ordinary diet. In lands where the growing season was short and olive oil had to be imported at ruinous expense, butter was the fat that made food edible and bodies warm. It was churned in farmhouses across Normandy, Flanders, Germany, Scandinavia, the British Isles. It was eaten by peasants and nobles alike, and crucially, for people who had almost no other affordable source of concentrated fat and calories, it was not optional. In the north, butter was the difference between a full stomach and an empty one. The scale of this reliance is hard to overstate. In some northern communities, records suggest ordinary people consumed astonishing quantities of butter each year, far more than we would consider normal today, because it was often the single richest thing on the table. It went into porridge, onto bread, into every pot of vegetables, a source of warmth and calories in places where winters were long and dark and cruel. Sailors and soldiers carried it as rations. Households measured their security in part by how much butter they had managed to put by. In the north, a full butter store was a kind of insurance against hunger. That value made butter into something more than food. It became a form of wealth. In many parts of medieval Europe, butter was used to pay rents and taxes, handed over to landlords and the church as a kind of edible currency. Butter markets sprang up in towns, often held around a special stone monument called a butter cross, where farmers came to sell their surplus. Good butter was a store of value you could taste. And in one of the strangest chapters of this whole story, some people did not just store their butter, they buried it. Across Ireland and Scotland, for reasons we still do not fully understand, people took large quantities of butter, packed it into wooden containers, and buried it deep in cold peat bogs. Archaeologists still find this so-called bog butter today, sometimes in casks weighing many pounds, and some of it is astonishingly old, buried centuries or even thousands of years ago. Some of it may have been hidden for safekeeping, a treasure protected from raiders. Some may have been buried to preserve it, since the cold, acidic, oxygen-poor bog is a natural refrigerator. And some historians think it may have been an offering, butter given to the earth or to the gods. Whatever the reason, it tells you how precious this fat was. People treated butter the way other cultures treated buried gold. But the most dramatic collision in butter's history was not about money or myth. It was about God. And this is where the story turns. The medieval Catholic Church governed not just the soul but the stomach. It imposed fasting on a scale that is hard for us to imagine today. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, and on many other fast days scattered throughout the year, the faithful were forbidden from eating certain rich foods. Meat was banned, and so were what the church called the products of milk, butter, cheese, cream. When you add up Lent and all the other fasting days, medieval Christians were expected to give up butter for a huge portion of every single year. Now, in the olive oil south, this was no great hardship. If you could not cook with butter during Lent, you simply cooked with olive oil, which was cheap, abundant, and everywhere. The ban barely touched daily life, but in the cold, butter-eating north, the same rule was a genuine crisis. Olive oil in the north was a luxury import, expensive and often of poor quality by the time it arrived. For ordinary people in Normandy or Germany or the Low Countries, being told to cook without butter for weeks on end was like being told to cook without a stove. The one fat they could afford, the fat their entire cuisine was built on, was suddenly a sin. So the church, in its wisdom, offered a solution. If you truly could not manage without butter during the fast, you could apply for a special permission, a dispensation that allowed you to eat it, and that permission was not free. You paid for it. In exchange for a fee handed over to the church, you received an official exemption, sometimes called a butter letter, that let you keep your butter through Lent without endangering your soul. Think carefully about what that arrangement actually was. The church took a food that people in the north desperately needed, declared that eating it during the fast was a sin, and then sold them the right to commit that sin without punishment. The restriction created the demand. The demand created the revenue, and the revenue was enormous. If you are finding this as fascinating as we do, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We uncover the hidden histories behind everyday foods every single week. And this next part is where butter left its mark in stone. Nowhere is that mark clearer than in Rouen. The great Cathedral of Rouen, in the heart of butter-loving Normandy, needed money for an ambitious new tower in the late 1400s and early 1500s. And a major source of that money, according to the tradition that gave the tower its enduring name, was the fees paid by local faithful for the privilege of eating butter during Lent. Coin by coin, dispensation by dispensation, the guilt of a whole city was converted into carved limestone reaching toward heaven. When it was finished, people did not forget where the money had come from. They named it the Tour de Beurre, the Butter Tower, and it still stands in Rouen today, a monument to God, financed by the human craving for a soft yellow fat. And it was not only the wealthy who paid. While a rich merchant could buy a comfortable exemption without a second thought, poorer families faced a harder arithmetic, weighing the cost of the fee against the misery of weeks of butterless meals. The system quietly sorted people by what they could afford. Those with money ate well through the fast and felt no sting. Those without either went without their butter or scraped together coins they could barely spare to buy back a food they had always taken for granted. The same fat that comforted the poor became, in the season of fasting, one more way to remind them of their place. Rouen was the most famous case, but it was not the only one. Other churches in the butter-eating north raised money the same way, and at least one other French tower carried the same nickname, born of the same bargain. The general practice of paying for butter dispensations was widespread across the Catholic North, a quiet, steady stream of income flowing from the dinner tables of ordinary people into the coffers of the church. For a long time, almost no one questioned it. It was simply how things worked. Until, in the early 16th century, someone did question it, loudly, and the whole arrangement became a symbol of everything that was rotten. That someone was Martin Luther. In 1520, in one of the founding documents of the Protestant Reformation, Luther pointed directly at the butter dispensations as an example of the church's corruption and hypocrisy. He wrote with fury that in Rome the leaders of the church mocked the fasting rules they imposed on everyone else, while ordinary Christians were made to feel that eating butter was a graver sin than lying or cheating, unless of course they paid for a letter of permission. Why, Luther demanded, should butter, which people needed to live, be turned into a source of guilt and a source of profit? The selling of permission to eat butter became, in his hands, a small but powerful piece of evidence in the enormous case he was building against the Church of Rome. It is a remarkable thing to sit with. One of the great ruptures in the history of the Western world, the Reformation that split Christianity in two and reshaped the map of Europe, drew part of its moral energy from something as humble as a fasting rule about butter. The fat that built the butter tower also helped, in its own small way, to crack the very institution that built it. After the storms of the Reformation passed, butter remained what it had always been in the North. A staple, a comfort, a quiet necessity. For centuries, it went on being churned by hand in farmhouses and dairies, a slow and physical labor, usually done by women, turning cream in a wooden churn until their arms ached and the fat finally came. And then, as with so many precious things in this series, the modern world arrived and changed everything. In the 19th century, industry came for butter. In 1878, a Swedish engineer named Gustaf de Laval invented a mechanical cream separator that could pull the cream from milk faster and more efficiently than anyone had ever managed by hand. Butter making moved out of the farmhouse and into the factory, out of the aching arms of dairy women and into tireless spinning steel. Production exploded on a scale no churn could ever match. And butter, once a stored form of wealth, began the long slide toward becoming cheap. But the most dramatic blow to butter's status came from an unexpected direction: a rival. In 1869, in France, a chemist named Hippolyte Mege responded to a challenge, reportedly encouraged by the Emperor Napoleon III, to invent a cheap butter substitute that could feed the army and the poor. What he created was a pale, spreadable fat made from beef, tallow, and milk, and it would come to be known as margarine. For the first time in history, butter had a competitor, an imposter, a cheaper stand-in that looked and spread almost like the real thing. What followed was decades of open war. The dairy industry was horrified and fought back with everything it had. In parts of the United States, powerful laws were passed to protect butter from its rival. Some states taxed margarine heavily. Others went further and banned margarine makers from dyeing their product yellow, forcing it to be sold as an unappetizing pale white. Sometimes, with a packet of coloring the buyer had to mix in at home, all to stop the imposter from looking too much like real butter. The battle between butter and margarine ran through kitchens and courtrooms for the better part of a century. Then, in the 20th century, butter faced an enemy more dangerous than any rival product: its own reputation. As modern science turned its attention to heart disease, saturated fat fell under suspicion, and butter, one of the richest sources of it, was cast as a villain. For decades, health authorities urged people to abandon butter for margarine and vegetable oils, and millions did. The fat that had once been holy was now treated as a quiet poison, something to be scraped off the plate in the name of a longer life. It was a stunning fall for a food that had sustained the North for 1,000 years. And yet, in a final twist, the science kept shifting. In more recent years, researchers have questioned the old certainties, and butter has come surging back into fashion, welcomed again onto the tables that had banished it. Feared, forgiven, feared, and forgiven again. And through it all, butter kept getting cheaper and more abundant, until at last it became what it is today: ordinary. The fat that once paid rents and funded cathedrals now sits in every refrigerator, sold in blocks and tubs for a few dollars, bought without a flicker of thought. The guilt is gone. The wealth is gone. The holiness is gone. What remains is just butter, waiting on the shelf. For thousands of years, this simple substance, nothing more than the fat of milk shaken until it clumps, shaped the world in ways almost no one remembers. It was churned by accident on the backs of wandering herders. It was poured into sacred fires in India and buried in the bogs of Ireland. It divided Europe into an oil-eating south and a butter-eating north, a line you can still faintly taste in the region's cooking today. It was declared a sin and then sold back to the faithful as a paid privilege, and the money it raised was carved into one of the great towers of Christendom. It even lent a spark to the fire that broke the medieval church apart. And that tells you something that is not really about butter at all. It is about how power works. The butter tower was not built out of butter. It was built out of restriction, out of the church's ability to take something people needed and turn the denial of it into money. The tower is stone, permanent and proud, and it was funded by the most humble and perishable thing imaginable, a fat that goes rancid in weeks. The lesson buried in that irony is that the grandest, most eternal-looking monuments are often raised on the smallest, most ordinary human needs and on someone's power to control them. So the next time you pull a block of butter from the fridge and spread it across your toast without thinking, take a second to consider what you are holding. This is the fat that herders discovered by accident and Indians made holy. The fat that Romans dismissed as barbarian and the North could not live without. The fat that people buried like treasure, that churches turned into sin, and that raised a tower still standing in Rouen 500 years later. A little yellow block that once helped divide a continent and crack a religion, now sitting quietly in your kitchen, costing about the same as a loaf of bread. Butter was never just a fat. It never was.